Over a year ago, we did something that seemed impossible. We sold just about everything, packed our lives into a few suitcases, and left America, and moved to Sicily with our 2 dogs. Fabrizio and I were new Christians at the time, trying to follow God the best way we knew how. We decided to move to Sicily for a slower way of life. Looking back now, we had so much to learn because we had come to Christ later in life. But we would be tested in ways we could not have imagined in the next months that followed. Because now I know that trusting God doesn't mean it's all roses and rainbows coming out of the gate. In fact, I think that the fires we go through are a way God forms our strength, our character, and our hearts if we are really willing to submit obediently to Him. And that's not easy. It's the truth. If you're new to stepping out in faith, that's like us. You're not alone. Our journey begins with Jesus.
I used to count my worth by what my hands could do, chasing rules like echoes, thinking they'd pull me through. Then I learned a different story, one that calls my name, crucified with Jesus, and nothing stays the same.
To this day, I feel grateful that He allowed me to experience Sicily during that season of my life. We didn't understand everything. We simply believed God was leading. I hope our story encourages you. Because sometimes trusting God doesn't mean having all the answers. Sometimes it means taking the next step and letting Him reveal the rest later.
How beautiful it is. So beautiful.
Just days before we arrived, Mount Etna had erupted. Airports were closing, flights were being delayed, yet somehow every detail of our trip worked out. Looking back, it truly felt like it was divine timing, for real. Because so many things could have gone wrong. Connecting flights in Frankfurt with the dogs, to name one huge concern. But despite the obstacles, God guided us through every step. Because He's good like that. The streets still carry traces of volcanic ash, covering the sidewalks and the roads. It was a reminder how powerful nature can be, and how perfectly timed our arrival was. One thing I've learned from this Sicilian journey is that God doesn't always remove obstacles, but He guides us and He strengthens us through them. One of the first things that surprised me most was how different life felt here. It felt like another world.
Now the only flags you're gonna see is Italy flags. Italian flags.
Be not afraid, only believe. Lift your hands, let your spirit breathe.
Ma qua c'è un
Be not afraid, only believe. He's the promise that we all receive. Oh, be not afraid.
Okay, let's scroll too.
Crowds
Every day, people created cute little traffic jams on the main street in town. People lined up for freshly baked bread. Not because it was trendy, but because it was simply how life was lived.
Say unto this mountain, be thou removed, and by His power the storms are soothed. I am the way, the truth, and the life, He cries. Walk with me through darkest night. Be not afraid, only believe. Take His hand, take the life He gives.
Sicily reminded me that God created life to be lived, not just survived, and not just with food, but in everything. I love how God uses these moments in our new environment to slow us down and to show us what really matters.
Quanto me lo sognavo un gelato di questo.
As we walk through Zafferana, we stopped to visit the local church. It was beautiful. The architecture, the details, the history. There was something peaceful about it. Standing there brought me back to my childhood. I remember the small Catholic church I attended growing up in Chicago. It wasn't grand or famous, but as a little girl, I remember thinking it was beautiful. Even then, before I understood much about God, I felt drawn to Him. Looking back now, I can see that God was pursuing me long before I knew how to pursue Him. When we visited this church in Zafferana, it stirred up memories I hadn't thought about in years. As a child growing up in Chicago, I loved going to our little Catholic church in the Mission. I didn't understand theology. I didn't know the Bible. I certainly didn't understand what a relationship with Jesus meant. But I remember being fascinated by the beauty of the church. The stained glass, the quietness, the flickering candles, the feeling that there was something bigger than me. Looking back, I think God was planting seeds in my heart even then. As a new Christian walking through this church, I found myself reflecting on my childhood. Growing up, church was one of the few places where I felt a sense of peace. Even though I would spend many years wandering far from God, He never stopped reaching for me. Standing there in Sicily, thousands of miles from Chicago, I couldn't help but think about how faithful God has been. Through every mistake, every detour, through every season of my life, He was still leading me. Standing inside that church, I found myself thinking about that little girl in Chicago. A little girl who didn't know what her future would hold. A little girl who would experience heartbreak, trauma, confusion, years of searching. Yet somehow, despite all of it, God never let her go. Looking around that church in Sicily, I was overwhelmed by the realization that God had carried me all the way from that little church in Chicago to this very moment. Not because I had done anything right, but because He is faithful.
Where?
Arcobaleno.
Yeah.
Vedi? Schiodi. Arcobaleno.
Ooh.
I thought we had finally arrived. We were grateful, hopeful, excited for what God had ahead. We couldn't see the whole picture yet, but God was already at work. Then Fabrizio, his mother, and I walked down to the piazza together. The piazza was very significant for Fabrizio and I because when we started dreaming and planning our move to Zafferana, Sicily, years before, we would watch the Zafferana webcam of this exact piazza. We would watch the people walking, sitting on the benches, kids playing soccer, riding their bikes. It just was calling us. And we dreamt about being there someday. So to go and walk and sit on the very benches that we had watched for years was truly a special moment. We had no idea how much our lives were about to change. But even before the difficult lessons came, God was showing us His faithfulness.